Hi, friend.
Hi, friend.
And to the brave hearts listening out there, welcome to Permission to Be Human. I'm Andrea.
And I'm Janelle.
Get ready for some real-time relationship woo and wisdom
from the front lines with occasional tantrums and tears
about how breaking rules, blurring boundaries, and tossing tradition can be catalysts for finding your truth.
Let's debunk the fairy tales we were told as children and create a new map for life.
Yes, Disney can go fuck itself.
If you're seeking permission to choose your own path,
freedom is the new F word, people,
and want to feel less alone along the way,
we got you.
Please note, this is our side of the story. Our partners and metamors have their own individual experiences, and we do not speak for them.
Why, hello, Andrea.
Hi, friend.
Hello.
We're talking about sex today.
Yay. You know, funny enough, we don't often talk about sex.
We really don't.
Even though some people may think that this podcast is about sex, we don't often talk about it.
No, it's not often not the topic. But as soon as we started talking about it, I'm just like, oh, I can't stop singing that George Michael song. We saw an article recently in the New York Times by Catherine Pearson, and the title was 8 Sex Myths That Experts Wish Would Go Away. And as we went through these, we each had some comments on them. And we're curious why they persist as myths, what could help things turn them around, and how could people be more aware of what's actually happening in the United States. And that's what the article was about. The first one is classic. Everyone else is having more sex than you. It's a constant jealousy. They're getting it and I'm not. They're getting some and I'm not. The facts are that it's pretty typical to find that about 1 in 3 people have no partnered sex in the prior year.
Have not had partnered sex?
Correct. So that's what Dr. Herbenek said, referencing several nationally representative surveys. She also pointed out that research is showing that sexual activity has declined in recent years for reasons that aren't fully understood. But in general, yeah, that's the truth. 1 in 3 people have had no partnered sex in the prior year. If you're not having sex, no one else is either, or very few people are either. I definitely used to think that everybody had it all figured out more than me, and that applies to everything. I'm like, oh, she looks perfect. Oh, she has the perfect purse. Oh, she has the perfect children.
And of course, she must be having perfect sex.
I'm associating this myth to everything. When you look at other people walking down the street, you assume other people have everything figured out and that you don't. And so I think sex is just another example of this. Janelle, what do you think about this myth?
I think the short answer, yes. For a long time, thought that everyone else was having more sex than me. And I think I thought that whether I was single or when I was married, I was in a perpetual cycle of wanting more sex than I was getting and feeling other people were getting it.
Yeah, and I do remember when I first became poly and I started to tell a few people, I remember 3 or 4 people were like, oh yeah, we never have sex, or like sex is a trouble issue for us. And it definitely rose to the top. It's like, oh, okay, people are struggling. Everyone's struggling more than you think. And sex is just another topic where they're struggling.
And I would say that once I got into a relationship and once we got into non-monogamy and polyamory and started reading a ton of books on relationships and sexual connection and intimacy and all these different things, that's when I realized, oh, I'm actually not alone in this. To your point that a lot of people are not having sex. A lot of couples are not having sex. It was just my perception that everyone else was.
Okay, so myth number 2 is it's normal for sex to hurt.
It's not, period. It's not normal. And this is just anecdotally, but probably most women at some point in their life had at least a moment of time where sex hurt. I've never had a baby, so I haven't done that. I had to go through the OB process. But my gyne, who's incredible, is checking me out for health reasons. She's not necessarily inherently checking me out for pleasure reasons, although she is an advocate for pleasure. And what I have since learned is that there are pelvic floor specialists. There's other people who specialize in yoni massages, where they are intentionally focused on your womb area and your clit to discover if there's pain, why, and how can we release it. Pelvic floor specialists, I'm sure, have been around for a very long time. And it's one of those industries, because it's there to serve women's pleasure, is very under the carpet. I just want you to know that if you're someone who does experience pain with sex, like, and a medical doctor is not giving you the answer, that there are, like, to look at alternatives.
So wait a second, a pelvic floor specialist, PFS, I've never even heard of this. Should I ask my gynecologist to find it? Should I Google it? Do they work at a hospital? Is it connected to gynecology? Do they do pap smears?
No.
And is it specifically for menopause?
No. I'm going to suggest look it up on Google. I know several practitioners, so I know women who do this work, and they're trained in it, but they're not working out of a medical facility. It's more in the realm, I would say, of like a massage versus medical intervention.
Okay. All right. That gives me a little bit of a category at least.
Think of it as being massaged from the inside. I did something similar last year with a shamanic de-armoring. And I've talked about it on the podcast before, where I put a crystal wand inside of me and I would feel energy release, and it would release in the form of tears or laughter or crying or screaming. So it's that kind of idea where there's so much energy in there that causes pain, but that energy gets to be released, then pleasure can result. But again, you've never even heard of this, right? Here we are, best friends who talked about a million things. I'm very aware of this, and lots of people aren't. So that's why I'm like, look for help.
Would you say that a pelvic floor specialist is more of a physical specialist or an energy worker?
It's touching. So it's not energy, and that they might be working with energy, but they're doing it through touch, versus like a Reiki would just be like, you're not touching, you're just working with the energy body. The pelvic floor specialist is definitely working with the body.
Okay. And this can be nothing to do with a baby, just to do with what's going on during sex and with your pleasure.
Right. I think there's lots of reasons why you could go see one. And if you have pain during sex, that's a number one reason to go.
Got it. Okay. Great. Okay. What else?
So then as someone who is in menopause, and I have had some of the best sex in my life in menopause. So just also naming that. And it's not because of menopause specifically, but that I was going along feeling fine. Like a lot of people said, oh, you can become really dry, right? You lose your vaginal moisture in menopause. Well, I think it's 4 years that I've been in menopause. And so like going along. And then like literally like one day having sex, and I was like, oh my gosh. And it felt like sandpaper. So weird. Like I wonder what just happened. And then had sex again a couple weeks later. I was like a wound that was healing. Like it was almost like I had a scab that like scratched off. And I was like, I don't know what's happening. My pussy became like weepy in terms of like, I was very wet all of a sudden. And so I went to the doctor. It was hard to figure out. They couldn't see anything. I went to the gynecologist, had an ultrasound. And in the end, she was like, I think that you're just really dry and you probably got like a little tiny scratch. And I was like, okay, weird. Like this hadn't happened. It just like overnight. In my case, I opted to take estradiol, which is estrogen cream, and night and day difference on how it made. So like where sex was like, oh, I'm not doing that again, to, oh, it's great.
Awesome. Okay. So a couple notes there. You mentioned estradiol as an estrogen cream. That's helpful for this. Estradiol is also my patch that I wear that stops my hot flashes. Multiple purposes for that. I'm sure there's other reasons too. I'm also curious. I mean, you mentioned menopause. You were in menopause for 4 years, and you know you're in menopause because
the way that the Western medical profession defines it is if you have not had a moon cycle for a period for 12 months straight consecutively.
Of course, I would not know this because I have an IUD and I don't get a period and I don't have a moon cycle. And so how will I know when I'm actually in menopause versus being in perimenopause?
I think when you decide to take your IUD out.
I'm not taking my IUD out for as long as they let me keep it in, I'm keeping that thing in.
Yeah, so that's a really great question. I do not have the answer. I wish a doctor could call in and be like, this is how you do it. I don't know. Like there's some markers. Like if you had a blood test, that there could be some markers of that. But if that was the case, then why would they measure out 12 periods? So I don't know.
Yeah, I don't either. I've always like, oh no, I want to keep my IUD in, obviously because it keeps me from getting pregnant, but it also stops my periods, which is a total life hack to me. All right, so it's not normal for sex to hurt. I've had pain just occasionally with sex across the years. I think it's really been when maybe I haven't been as sexually active and my body just feels like it closed a little bit. Dried up a bit. I haven't been thinking about sex, wasn't on my mind.
Right, like blood flow wasn't going to the area in that way.
And, a little lube, not such a bad thing either. Sex could be hurting because there's a bigger issue like you've had where you needed antibiotics. That sex could also be hurting because you don't have enough lube. Or you could use a little lube. Don't be afraid to use the lube.
Yes. And that's another one of the myths. If sex is hurting and you use lube and then it doesn't hurt, then great. I think what we're talking about is like if lube isn't the solution and it's still hurting.
Yeah. Got it. Okay. So myth number 3 is men want sex more than women do. The author talked about how this desire discrepancy is the number one problem that she sees. So I guess desire discrepancy is a big problem. And because of this myth, we stereotype men are supposed to want sex, women are not supposed to want sex. And because of this, men often feel a sense of shame if they don't have desire. And what I've never thought about, though, is that women might also feel shame because they do have that desire. There is data to suggest that men masturbate more often than women do. It's just pretty much untrue that women don't want sex. They still want it. And all the therapists and doctors say, look, it's very common to have various fluctuations in the week from a male or a female. Sometimes women want it more, sometimes men want it more. So what's your experience with this?
I have found that the more I'm having sex, the more I want sex. So, which is an interesting conundrum. In partnership, if I'm having sex, like I could be the one that wants it more, for sure. I agree that there's a lot of conditioning around this idea that men are supposed to want it more. And that often I think there's a conditioning around women who are getting together to talk and chat and about gossip, right? I was like, oh, my husband wants more sex. That they're like just having something to deal with. That's not what I'm saying every woman is doing, but that is in a rom-com formula that fits. And for in a relationship, if the woman actually wants more sex than the man, then what's wrong with her? She doesn't talk about it. There's shame that the man doesn't want the sex, shame that the woman isn't getting the sex. And so there's an isolation in my experience that happens when the woman wants more sex than the man doesn't. I mean, that was my experience.
Yeah, that makes sense. There's a lot of social conditioning that we don't even realize that we have just from a deep place about sex. And I think we do get it from movies. We were just watching a Halloween movie about teens. And of course, the guy wants sex. The woman doesn't want to give the sex yet. That's pretty much the storyline I watched growing up. So I do want sex, but at the same time, if I'm distracted enough for long periods of time, then I can forget about it. Or at least I could in my 30s. Yeah, and even in a polyamorous relationship, there's a lot of assumption about sex. About poly means you're going outside and having multiple sexual partners.
And you're having a ton of sex.
People can define polyamory in many different ways. For me, it's the sex is included, but it's not about the sex. It's about additional romantic relationships that may or may not include sex.
There's a phrase, it's like the myth that everyone thinks that poly means more sex. Poly just means a lot more talking about sex, but not actually having sex. It's just a lot more processing about sex.
Yeah, I can probably vouch for both. I heard you say that the more sex you get, the more you want, which to me sounds like water or exercise.
Oh my gosh, so good. I would say ultimately that probably the biggest for me in the myth here, like that men want sex more than women, is ultimately that all of us change. Like they change by the decade, change by the day, change by like, do I have kids? Do I not have kids? Like both men and women's desires for sex, it changes all the time.
There's so much fluctuation for desire. It's the message I want to say to the Bravehearts or to any women listening is like, and to any men listening, it is more than okay to want sex and to crave sex and to love sex. Sex is healthy.
And on that note, the next myth is
sex means penetration. Yes, sex therapists often lament that people get caught up in certain sexual scripts or the idea that sex needs to unfold in a particular way. Typically a bit of foreplay, and then that leads to intercourse. And I've been talking a lot lately about letting go of form. And this is just another example of sex can look lots of different ways. It doesn't have to include penetration. I mean, sex is clearly so much more, but I feel like I've known this for a long time. And I do think I had this nuance in my head, though, that if I was with someone and we fooled around, we didn't cross the threshold. Like if we didn't have sex, it was okay. If we didn't have penetration, definitely early on, I was like, well,
P in the V.
What'd you say?
P in the V. Penis in the vagina?
I never said it that way. P in the V.
Bravehearts. I just got an acronym over on Andrea. Wow.
Totally. I've never. It's so great. So rhymey. Love it. P in the V. Early on in my 20s, say during college, when I was first experimenting with sex, I'm like, oh, this is what sex is like. It just felt like it didn't count. Do you remember? Did you have like a number? No. How many people have you had sex with? At a certain point, I'm sure you were keeping track.
Yes, for sure. For sure in college, I have definitely stopped keeping track.
Yes, I stopped keeping track a long time ago. But there was a point where like it was like a number. And I was like, oh, what's your number? Yeah. It was something we talked about. It was discussed. And I didn't want to go too high, but I didn't want it to be too low either.
I don't actually know what my number is, but I have a pretty good range of where I'm at. I am well above 50. And I'm just saying that out loud, that I have no problem with that.
No, that's great. I don't have any problem with that. But when I was 25, I didn't think that way. Did you?
Yeah. Like the number really mattered. And I'm saying this more for brave hearts out there. Some of you might be like, okay, that's totally fine. Some of you might be like, holy fucking shit, that is insane. Totally. So I also acknowledge that. So however it is, whatever you're feeling in your body right now and hearing those numbers, it's fine. But I want you to hear that I like totally own this about me. And that this is like, yeah, sex with most, obviously multiple partners is part of my life's journey. But I've been deeply intimate. A lot of people.
Because I wanted to keep my numbers low in my 20s, I feel like I was like, well, I didn't have sex with him, so it didn't count. Or I didn't penetrate, so it didn't count. Yes. Because I was afraid of my number being too high. Because that would make me a slut, basically. That was what I thought for sure in my 20s. I honestly have no idea what my number is. I remember losing track when it was like in the 20s. It's high, but it's probably not as high as yours just because I was married for so long. I wasn't out and about.
Right. I mean, I was single until I was 40. Then I was in a non-monogamous relationship.
Have as much sex as you want. Do it your way. No, there's definitely no judgment about that. So you want to say anything else about sex not meaning penetration?
I've only finally been able to understand in my body through this whole journey of my pleasure and understanding what my pleasure is, where I've been able to expand my view of what sex is.
Because I think originally I did associate the pleasure and the orgasm with the penetration. I feel like maybe society taught me or what I learned. And then I remember realizing maybe in my 20s, I'm like, oh, I can orgasm without penetration. Mm-hmm. And I really like that better. Mm-hmm. And so I learned to do that myself. Okay, next myth. Orgasms come from penetration only.
Which was a nice segue because you just said you figured out that.
I did early on that touch on my clit is where I typically would get the orgasm. And I probably didn't orgasm from penetration until 5 or 10 years ago. Definitely through most of my life, that wasn't, I'm just like, okay, yeah, that's for you. This other thing's for me. Different parts of pleasure. This is also expanding our idea of what an orgasm is. I feel like I've had lots of different types of orgasms. I was thinking about how do I define an orgasm other than just the traditional way we're thinking about it. So I think I define it as any elevated and enchanting sensation that affects both my body and my spirituality.
Oh, I want to say that out loud. Any elevated and enchanting sensation that affects both my body and my spirituality.
It's not quite complete because I feel like there has to be a more of an intensity to it for it to be an orgasm. Mm-hmm. But I do think I've really expanded the idea of what an orgasm can look like. And in addition, sometimes I don't have to orgasm. I'm just enjoying the during, which is its own orgasm to me. Would you agree?
Yes. And I was talking to a woman the other day who said that she can count 24 different ways that she orgasms in her body. And she's like, oh, this is the sensation that happens when he pulls my hair this way. Here's a sensation when he kisses like the back of my ear this way. Like it was like she was really incredibly attuned to her body and how there was a slightly different pleasure and sensation and intensity in this depending on where in her body was getting activated. Also, as I'm saying that, this isn't like a competition. Like if you just have one type of orgasm, that's also fine. If you don't and you want it, it's open for exploration. I'm not on the hunt for 24 here, but I have really opened my view. One thing that happened to me, I remember, is at the ISTA where I was making out with somebody, and then I kind of like didn't dissociate, but just wasn't fully present. So he's like, okay, like, what do you want to do? I was like, okay, I'm just gonna like, you can just like sit here, be touching me, but I just want to like kind of be in my own body for a moment. And so he just like sat at my feet and just grazed my foot in such a way that it tickled. And I experienced this like full body laugh, like all the way up. It was an orgasmic release. And recognizing, oh, laughter for me can be an orgasm relief. In fact, another woman, she and I call them giggle-gasms, where like the laughter is like what's vibrating my entire body. And that can be activated from a touch. It could be from a heart connection. So that has also expanded my view.
Awesome. Yeah, let's talk about some like different ways the release looks like. So it can be a chill, like a chill forms across my body from feet to head, which feels kind of like a full body orgasm. Crying, definitely a big release.
I will say with crying, like I used to think something, of course, was wrong with me because my friend said she cried during orgasm. And I was like, oh my gosh, I must obviously have just had a terrible orgasm. I've never had good orgasms. And I really held that as a benchmark for decades. The fact that I didn't cry during orgasm. And I remember like, it's just in the past year that it has happened. And I was like, oh, it's not that this is a better orgasm than another. It's just touching a different part of me.
I would say some orgasms put you into a slightly different state of consciousness where I lose orientation about what's going on a little bit, but in a pleasant way, not in a scary way. But even looking at who I'm with, taking in the room, there's some kind of
like transcendent or trance state.
Yes. And there's a movement of my body that feels like it's in slow motion, or it's like it's moving through the air at a different frequency. Another one is like an energy circle where I feel like, oh, all the way through, mouths coming together, genitals coming together, and there's like some full circle of energy going.
Like a circuit.
And then there's also that sex wrestling I've talked about where I'm not looking, someone's behind me and I'm wrestling with them, they're holding me down, I'm trying to get away. It's that resistance, like push resistance, push pull, that really gives me a lot of pleasure. I used to think that my breasts were just like erroneous because they just didn't really like, I don't know, like you can touch them if you want. If it makes you happy, you can touch them, but it doesn't do much for me. And it depends now. Like I found different ways to do it, but I also think my arms are actually where my tits are. My arms are just very sensitive and I always want touched on my arms. My chest is like more of a hit or miss.
So in this Modern Priestess course that I'm taking right now, talking about all the different sensations that a body has in the context of kink or BDSM play, right? There's all these different types of floggers. And the idea is that, well, each one creates a different sensation in the body, and which sensation is the one that turns you on. So I had this experience recently. My nipples and breasts, not particularly sensitive. I have a little bit more pleasure watching someone lick them. If my eyes were closed, I might not sense that they were licking them. Like they're really not that sensitive. And then someone had me flick my nipple. They flicked my nipple and I was like, that's fun. And so I was like, oh, there is a touch that turns on my breasts. It's just not the touch I have been doing for the last 49 years. Again, like this exploration of there's so many different ways that each of us and then all of us can discover pleasure in our bodies.
And I'm hearing the message is like, keep seeking. It's okay to want what you want.
Yes.
And nothing's too weird. Maybe you want honey dripped on your breast.
And it might be weird, but that weird becomes a judgment of society. So as long as you can navigate it.
Yeah, then more power to you. Okay, next myth is that vaginas shouldn't need extra lubricants. Apparently, 17% of women between 18 and 50 report vaginal dryness during sex. Well, more than 50% experience it after menopause, which we talked about. So the bottom line is like, there's nothing shameful about lubricants. So stop it with the stigma, people. I used to have it too, thinking, oh, well, this means I'm not turned on enough. And so therefore I'm failing, or you're failing, or then someone feels guilty. Sometimes we're wet and sometimes we're dry, and all sorts of things impact that, what you ate and the medicine you're on. And if you had some gummies that night, because they dry you out, for fuck's sake.
I used to wonder if Claritin was part of the reason I was dried out, because I took a decongestant.
Exactly. Or something you can take for your skin can also dry everything out. So I'd say tools are underrated. So is weed.
Now I know. Yes, so agreed. there's no such thing as too much lubricant. And I think I used to outsource the condoms to the man, right? Like, do you have the condoms? And now I have the condoms, I have the lube. I have become so comfortable, like, okay, nope, oh, condoms going on, lube's going on. They go hand in hand. I don't think twice about it. And I realize that it's really my own ownership of what my body wants and needs is why I'm more comfortable. And I'm not like, oh, is it okay that I want more lube? It's like, oh, I'm good. I'm grabbing the lube.
You're taking care of yourself, taking responsibility for your own orgasm, taking responsibility for your own pleasure. Very empowering, not relying on someone else to take care of it. Yeah, exactly. Love it. Okay. Next sex myth is that desire should be immediate. I guess therapists and researchers believe that there are two types of desire: spontaneous, or the feeling of like wanting sex out of the blue. And then there's responsive, which arises in response to stimuli like touch. It is very possible to go into sex without spontaneous desire as long as there's willingness and consent. And just like I talked about working out in the water, a doctor in this article likens it to going to the gym when you don't feel like it. Your endorphins start flowing, you feel really good, and you're grateful you went afterward. The bottom line is that it can be spontaneous or it can be responsive to stimuli. Either way, desire works.
And I would add this, that there's so many books on this. Come As You Are by Emily Nagasaki is like the go-to people to read about this topic. She talks about gas and brakes, like that desire is gas and desire is brakes. And that for what you were saying, that in terms of responsive desire, yes, if someone's touching me, like that could get me going. But a break could be that the child is crying because there's no childcare, or like the dishes are piled up in the sink. And so oftentimes for women specifically, like there's like the breaks, it's not just about the gas, like, oh, give me more touch. It's also about, can you remove the brakes?
Yeah, that resonates for me a lot too.
And I'm someone where my desire is not immediate. It's more like contextual, in anticipation. It's very touch oriented, but yeah, what is it for my brain to be able to like shut down? For me, it has to do with feeling like trusting and a relaxed nervous system. But it's not like, if that's there, then I'm going to be like, whoa, the second something happens.
So when you say that your desire is not spontaneous, does that mean desire for sex or desire for a particular partner?
Oh, I think we're talking about sex. So I don't think I was talking about a particular partner.
I know, but to me, it's pretty related. So that's why I asked.
I've had this happen, but it was like really maybe in my 20s, where there was one time where like I touched, someone's leg and I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm so turned on right now. That doesn't happen to me, even if the person I'm sitting next to, I really am in love with.
Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, the final myth is planned sex can't be thrilling. And as someone who is married, and you have been married, I definitely can attest that like planned sex can be thrilling. In the beginning, you don't think it's going to be because you're planning it, and it's in the same breath as the phrase Google Calendar, which is really just hard to overcome sometimes. But I definitely agree. There can be anticipation, there can be buildup, and it takes a commitment from both people to say, yes, we're doing this tonight, it's happening, and we're going to squeeze it in wherever we can. But having it on the calendar it definitely can lead to awesome sex.
I've got two stories. So there's two couples that I know, and then I'll talk about myself. One who did blowjob and gymnastics Wednesday nights. And that was just like, okay, here's what's happening. Kids have their activity. And then, so we've got time then to be together for the hour and a half. I just loved this so much because I knew that it was just like, they're like, oh, okay, we can, like, we've got gymnastics on the calendar. Why don't we have, like blowjobs and sex on the calendar? It was a really like a normalization. And also there was something that for me, I always just got joy on a Wednesday knowing that this was happening. And then I have another another couple where it was in their vows that they would dedicate, like one night a month. And that was where they were bringing their curiosity, their energy, like they were just dedicated to making sure that they kept that connection alive. Knowing that there would be times when they didn't want to, but that they knew they were putting it as a value of their relationship, that even if, whatever, tired, not feeling connected, right? Like they're in a fight. They're like, okay, no, this is our night. Whatever is here, we're still going to work through it. We're still going to play with that energy.
So on that note, and I know I really like your next story here, but I also want to say that it's nice to plan the sex night, however much you're doing it. And then that night, if you don't feel like having sex, then, okay, we're laying together naked and we're holding each other and we're connecting.
Well, right. And that kind of comes back to like, is the sex penetration, right? Like, there's something else is being touched inside of you that is really nourishing.
Sometimes we need it. And that's where you have to like drop the script, forget the agenda, read the room, like what wants to happen tonight. There are times when we're like exhausted, stressed, haven't even talked, in 48 hours. We just need to like come together naked, reassure each other, do some spooning. And that just felt better.
Yes, of course. I will say in terms of the word sex here versus what you just described is this activation of the life force energy, I think is very specifically how I would describe like a sacred sexuality, like connecting yourself to like the erotic current of life. That is what helps us feel more alive.
Yeah, I agree.
So however you get to that current, whether it's penetration, whether it's kissing, whether it's cuddling, but if that current gets activated in you, that's what I think for me is really ultimately the goal. And then as far as from my perspective, is like, planned sex can't be thrilling. I disagree. I actually really like knowing that sex is coming. My nervous system feels better. My lover and I had a date the other day, and I'm someone who gets really tired at night. But I also don't like getting up early. Like I'm the person who's like, I'm an early to bed and late to rise kind of person. We hadn't seen each other in a while and we were going to go to dinner. And I knew if we go to dinner, we'd have a drink and then it'd be late. And I was like, you know what? I was like, how about we start with sexy time and then we go to dinner and then out. And so that's what we did. And so he walked in the door. And I had planned this out already. So so that wasn't a surprise. Like we already knew that that's how like the night was going to be structured. And it was so fun. And then like we took a little bit of like a rest and then like we went out to dinner and we got to like be our most energized and excited in the moment of intimacy versus when like we're both so tired and drained now from the night that we just had.
Love it. Love it. That's great. Okay, Bravehearts. I'm going to read off these sex myths one more time. And I want you to choose one to say like, okay, what is a myth that you need to overcome? The sex myths, again, are everyone else is having more sex than you.
It is normal for sex to hurt.
Men want sex more than women do.
Sex means penetration.
Orgasms come from penetration only.
Vaginas shouldn't need extra lubricant.
Desire should be immediate.
And planned sex can't be thrilling.
Yeah. Which one is a myth that has been perpetuating in your body and in your mind? And I challenge you to overcome it.
Yeah. And if you need something else to do, you can try that little playful pleasure activation session idea that I gave you, which is just take the destinations off the table and discover the playground of pleasure that is your body.
Yay. I hope we dispelled some myths for you and
have fun.
Have fun having sex.
Do you need permission to be human? You got it.
Listen, subscribe, and review on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Learn more about us at permissiontobehuman.live.